What if the people you love and the people you hate are just mirrors? Not of who they are, but of what you've forgotten, rejected, or buried within yourself. It sounds absurd, offensive even, because we're taught to trust our judgments, to believe that our reactions are truth, that some people are just toxic and others perfect. But Carl Jung offered a much darker and much more liberating possibility, that our strongest feelings toward others are often projections of the parts of ourselves we've refused to face, not because we're bad, but because we were never taught how to carry the weight of who we really are. You don't just project flaws, you project needs, traumas, longings, and forgotten gifts. The things you mock in others may be the very things you once lost. The things you chase and love may be faces you assigned without knowing. And until you become conscious of this invisible mechanism, you will be manipulated not by others, but by your own unconscious. Your pain will choose your partners, your fear will sabotage your peace, and you'll keep wondering why life feels like a loop you can't escape. In this video, we're going to expose that loop. You'll see how projection hides in everyday life, ruins relationships, and distorts your identity. More importantly, you'll learn how to take your power back. If you're ready to stop running from your reflection, like this video and subscribe now. Your truth is waiting. It's closer than you think. There's something strangely familiar about the people we can't stand. That woman who always talks too much. It's that man who never takes anything seriously. The coworker who's always seeking validation, or the neighbor who acts like they know it all. We swear it's just them. But what if Carl Jung was right and we're not really reacting to them, but to something we buried in us? This is the foundation of psychological projection explained. The traits we disown internally don't disappear. They disguise themselves as other people. The more we suppress, the more they return in a face we despise. It's not because they're evil, but because they hold a mirror we're afraid to look into. This is one of the most common unconscious mind traps, believing we are pure and the world around us is the problem. But Jung taught that the things we react to with intensity are rarely random. They're keys. If you dare turn them, they unlock the shadow you've spent years denying. That's not just philosophy, it's survival. Imagine a poor single mother, judged by others for yelling at her kids in public. But look closer often. The harshest critics are other mothers. Mothers who silently feel guilty for not being present enough. Or take the man who shames others for being weak. What you'll find if you dig deep enough is a man who wasn't allowed to cry as a child, who buried his need for tenderness so deeply, he now punishes it in others. Shadow work, Jung insisted, begins here, with the humility to ask, what if my judgment is self-hate wearing a mask? The poor and working class especially are conditioned to toughen up, survive first, feel later. But unprocessed emotion doesn't vanish. It festers. And when we meet someone who behaves like we wish we could, but don't allow ourselves to, call it annoying, disgusting, selfish. We attack them so we don't have to face what they awaken. Projection is self-protection, but at a deadly cost. Many mere relationships psychology tries to untangle are built on this exact mechanism. It's that friend who always brings out the worst in you. It's that partner you keep attracting who triggers all your fears. These aren't coincidences. They're teachers. And they only have power over you because your inner child wounds are still raw. You don't overreact to what you understand. You overreact to what still hurts. That's why shadow work isn't just for therapists, it's for every exhausted parent, every frustrated worker, every person who's tired of blaming the world and getting no peace. We keep thinking if we just cut out the toxic people, we'll be okay. But the same characters show up again and again, just with different faces. Why? Because the lesson isn't them, it's you. This truth is hard to digest, but it's the beginning of self-awareness shadow work. Not to shame yourself, but to finally liberate yourself from the stories you didn't even know you were stuck inside. Carl Jung projection was never meant to make you feel guilty. It was meant to make you conscious. Consciousness begins with accountability. Not the harsh perfectionist kind, but the kind that says, if I'm the one judging, maybe I'm the one who needs healing. That's not weakness, that's power. Because the moment you reclaim what you gave away, your voice, your sensitivity, your assertiveness, you no longer need others to carry it for you. Think of projection like an emotional offloading system. We dump the unbearable parts of ourselves onto others to lighten the load. But the more we do this, the more fragmented we become. We can't recognize our own face anymore. And so, every new encounter becomes a distorted reflection, a test, an invitation. Are you ready to take it back? Are you willing to feel what you've tried so hard to numb? That's where real strength lives. Not in control, but in integration. The trap is subtle. You don't know you're doing it. That's why it's so dangerous. A person who sees themselves as morally superior can project cruelty onto others just to maintain that image. A perfectionist who secretly hates how tired they are might accuse others of being lazy just to avoid facing their own limits. These projections create conflict, isolation, burnout. They ruin marriages, friendships, workplaces. Worst of all, they keep your growth hostage. Because you can't heal what you won't admit exists. That's why understanding the emotional triggers, meaning behind your reactions, is vital. Not every annoyance is a projection, but if your reaction is explosive, repetitive, and exhausting, probably is. And if you're brave enough to follow it back to its root, you'll find something tender, something ancient, something that didn't deserve to be banished. That's where your peace is waiting. That's where you finally stop fighting ghosts. Let's be honest. Most people never do this because it's easier to project than to reflect. It's easier to hate the world than to feel how much it hurt you. This is especially true in communities where vulnerability is seen as weakness and where survival demands emotional shutdown. But that pain doesn't disappear, just disguises itself until someone triggers it and you explode. That's not a flaw, it's a cry, a memory resurfacing, a mirror begging to be faced. Trauma projection in love is a perfect example. Don't fall for people by accident. We're pulled to them by wounds we haven't healed. We think it's passion, but often it's pain. And unless we confront what we've been projecting, we'll keep choosing partners, not for love, but for familiarity. And familiarity can be fatal if your past was filled with rejection, control, or emotional starvation. That's not fate. That's repetition. The gift of this realization is simple, but radical. You don't have to keep reliving your past. You don't have to keep seeing your father in every authority figure, your ex in every new date, your guilt in every confident woman. The moment you recognize projection is the moment you can rewrite the script. You can pause, reflect, ask, what part of me is reacting? What does it really need? This is the quiet revolution Carl Jung was pointing to. Not just to diagnose others, but to retrieve the pieces of your soul scattered in every judgment, every overreaction, every fantasy. Because they were never really out there. They were parts of you asking to come home. So the next time you feel a strong reaction, pause, don't suppress, don't explode. Get curious. What is this person showing me about myself? What if just for today you answered, not with shame, but with compassion? Maybe you were never overreacting to them. Maybe you were overreacting to a version of you that never got to be. That's the haunting truth behind Carl Jung's projection theory. That's where your freedom begins. Because once you reclaim those abandoned parts, you no longer fear the mirror. You walk into the world whole. That wholeness cannot be manipulated. Not by relationships, not by culture, not by fear. And if you're ready to start that process to stop running from your reflection, then I invite you to explore the deeper materials. We've selected for you in the first pinned comment. Start where it hurts. That's where the door is. And if this made you reflect on someone you've been judging lately, tell us about it in the comments. What part of yourself might they be showing you? You can spend your whole life trying to avoid a feeling and still become shaped by it. That's the paradox of repression. What you won't allow yourself to feel doesn't disappear. It festers. And then it disguises itself as behavior, attitude, even identity. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the parts of us we exile to survive. But exile doesn't mean death, it means silence. And silence, over time, mutates into sabotage. A woman who is never allowed to be angry might become overly accommodating till one day she erupts in ways she doesn't understand. A man who learned that vulnerability is weakness might become emotionally numbed till he wakes up one day. This is how you become what you refuse to see. It's not through choice, but through abandonment. When you refuse to face your wounds, they become your destiny. One of the most devastating examples of this is the burnout epidemic among working-class people. Men and women raised to believe they must push through everything often suppress their exhaustion, their frustration, their grief, because there's no time to feel. But those denied emotions build up like pressure in a sealed container. Eventually, they leak out as anger, depression, or sudden breakdowns. This isn't just bad luck, it's the psychology of collapse. A slow destruction caused by years of disowning what's too painful to acknowledge. The more you reject your needs, the more you begin projecting them onto others, seeing everyone else as too sensitive, too weak, too selfish. This is the cost of unacknowledged pain. You don't just lose access to parts of yourself, you start hating them in others. That's how the unconscious enemy takes over. Quietly, gradually, through your silence. It's not always explosive. Sometimes it's subtle. A mother who constantly gives, but secretly resents her children. A teacher who becomes cynical, not because they don't care, but because they cared too much and were never supported. A partner who sabotages intimacy because it makes them feel unsafe. These aren't random personality flaws. They're signals. Echoes of parts that have been ignored for too long. The deeper truth. Many of us have been performing survival roles since childhood, roles that never gave us space to feel fully human. We were the good girl, the strong one, the funny one, the caretaker, and those roles become masks. But no mask is comfortable forever. Eventually, the face underneath begins to suffocate. And in that suffocation, the unconscious enemy is born. A version of you don't recognize, but that acts on your behalf anyway. This is where psychological projection explained by Jung becomes more than theory. It becomes a warning, a wake-up call. Because when we exile parts of ourselves for too long, they don't just sit quietly in the corner. They leak into our decisions. They color our relationships. They sabotage our peace. You think you're angry at your boss? But really, it's the part of you that feels powerless, screaming for your attention. You think your partner is too distant, but really it's your own fear of being seen. These aren't flaws to be ashamed of. They're maps. Every extreme reaction is a flare pointing to an emotional wound that hasn't been processed. And if you follow it, not with judgment, but with curiosity, you might just find the part of you that's been begging to come home. This is why self-awareness, shadow work, is essential, not optional. Because you don't rise above the shadow by ignoring it. You transcend it by facing it. That's where true power is born. Not in denial, but in integration. The enemy within only wins when you pretend they don't exist. But when you turn toward them not to destroy, but to understand, they transform. That bitterness becomes boundary. That rage becomes clarity. That sadness becomes depth. And that's not just spiritual poetry. It's survival in a world that rewards numbness. Because numbness is profitable. Some people buy more, work more, rebel less. But the cost is your soul. Your capacity to feel joy, connection, authenticity. Jung wasn't teaching a theory. He was offering a path back to yourself, one choice at a time. But here's the catch. Shadow work, Jung described, isn't glamorous. It's messy. It's lonely. It often feels like going backward, because you have to feel what you skipped. You have to sit with what you buried. And that takes courage. Not the kind you show in public, the kind you find when no one's looking. The courage to say, I'm not okay. I want to know why. That's where healing begins. Not with answers, but with honest questions. It's the kind of questions society doesn't want you to ask. Because if you reclaim your truth, you're harder to manipulate. You become unpredictable. You become free. And freedom, real freedom, threatens every system built on control. That's why this work isn't just personal, it's revolutionary. So the next time you find yourself sabotaging something good, pause. Don't just blame stress or the other person or fate. Ask, what part of me have I been ignoring? The person who snaps at love may have never been loved safely. The one who rejects praise may have been taught it was dangerous to be seen. These patterns don't define you, but they will repeat you until you become conscious. And once you are, everything changes. It's not because the world stops being difficult, but because you stop being your own prison. And that shift, that sacred confrontation, is where your life begins to feel like yours again. If this chapter stirred something in you, leave a comment. What part of you do you think has been running the show from the shadows? And if you want to go even deeper, check the first pinned comment. We've selected tools and books that can help you start this process in a grounded, powerful way. Because the enemy isn't who you think it is, and the freedom you crave isn't out there. It's buried inside, waiting for you to remember. We like to think we choose who we love, that it's about compatibility, shared values, timing. But what if our deepest attractions and repulsions aren't based on who the other person is, but on who they remind us of? This is one of the darkest and most misunderstood aspects of Carl Jung projection. When the past is unhealed, it doesn't stay in the past. It replays, not as memory, but as magnet. You're not drawn to them. You're drawn to something unresolved through them. And that's where trauma, projection, and love becomes dangerous. Because what looks like fate might just be repetition. You hated your father's control, you end up with someone who dominates you. You longed for your mother's warmth. You fall for someone emotionally unavailable. This isn't conscious. It's a trap. A trap disguised as love. Think about the people who've triggered you most in life. It's the ones who felt instantly unsafe or intoxicating. Those reactions weren't random. They were emotional echoes. A boss who reminds you of a dismissive parent. A friend who recreates the same power dynamics you had with a sibling. The projection isn't about the person, it's about the face your memory paints over them. This is mirror relationship psychology at its core. We don't see others as they are. We see them as we were. And unless we process those wounds, we keep reacting not to the present, but to the past. We keep punishing new people for old pain. That's not awareness, that's reenactment. A cycle that feels like destiny but was actually designed by your childhood. This is where inner child wounds become more than a metaphor. They become your unconscious operating system. Every unmet need creates a blueprint. And until that blueprint is updated through healing, you'll keep attracting or becoming what harmed you. A child who had to earn love may become an adult who performs for affection. A child who felt invisible may chase attention to feel real. And here's the twist. When someone comes along who treats you well, it might feel boring. Why? Because healthy doesn't match the chaos your nervous system was trained to expect. That's how psychological projection, explained by Jung, becomes a survival mechanism. You assign danger to safety, and safety to danger. Not because you're broken, but because you adapted. But what you adapt to can imprison you, especially in love. You might call it a soul connection when really it's a trauma bond. You might say, they feel like home, but home wasn't safe. That's why self-awareness shadow work is critical. It's not to overanalyze every feeling, but to interrupt the trance. To notice when your heart is chasing someone who hurts you just because they feel familiar. Familiarity isn't truth, it's memory. Sometimes your memory is the enemy. That's why it's so hard to leave. You're not just walking away from them. You're walking away from the hope that this time, the ending might be different. That this time, you'll be chosen. That this time, love will fix what childhood broke. But love doesn't heal trauma. Consciousness does. To be conscious means to pause. To feel the pull and ask why. To look at someone and say, what part of me are you waking up? Not to blame them, but to understand yourself. Because people don't awaken things in you randomly. They light up whatever still needs attention. That's the true meaning of emotional triggers. They aren't attacks, they're signposts. And if you're brave enough to follow the discomfort, it will always lead back to a younger version of you. A part that didn't get what it needed. A part that still believes it must suffer to be loved. That love must be hard. That intimacy must feel like survival. But none of that is true. It's just what you learned. And what you learned can be unlearned. Still, breaking this cycle is brutal. Because it doesn't just mean losing the person. It means losing the illusion. The story that says they are the answer. That if they just came back or changed or finally saw your worth, you'd be whole. But projection can't be healed by their love. Only by your honesty. Only by the moment you stop chasing a different outcome from the same pattern. You don't need closure from the one who mirrored your pain. You need closure from the part of you that thought you deserved it. That's where your power is. And once you reclaim that, you stop begging to be seen. You start seeing yourself. Fully, finally, fiercely. Carl Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious. It will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This is that fate. It's the one that keeps pulling you into familiar heartbreak, familiar rage, familiar confusion. Not because you're cursed, but because your mind is trying to resolve what your heart never could. That's why the face you gave them matters, because it wasn't their face. It was your father's, your mother's, your first heartbreak. And until you remove that mask, you'll never truly meet them more yourself. That's the tragedy of projection. But it can also be the beginning of transformation, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. And that's where your freedom starts to breathe. So ask yourself, who have you been assigning faces to? Who have you loved for the wrong reasons, or hated for reasons that weren't even theirs? Leave a comment and tell us what old story might still be choosing for you. And if you're ready to stop confusing trauma with truth, check the first pinned comment. We've chosen powerful tools to help you break the pattern, not in theory, but in your daily life. Because love should feel like growth, not like survival. You've spent years trying to fix the people around you. It's trying to be understood. It's trying to control your environment so you could finally feel safe. But what if the real work isn't out there? What if the real transformation begins the moment you turn inward? Not to analyze yourself to death, but to take ownership of the parts you've abandoned. Carl Jung didn't teach projection to blame people. He taught it so we could reclaim power. Because every trigger is a key. Every judgment is a map. And every person you love or hate carries a piece of the story you've been afraid to face. The world you see is not neutral. It's colored by your wounds, shaped by your history, filtered through your shadow. But that doesn't mean you're broken. It means you're human, and humans can change. So the next time you feel a strong emotional reaction, pause. Before you act, before you defend, before you run. Ask yourself, what part of me is speaking right now? What face from my past have I put onto this person? And what would happen if I chose to respond with clarity instead of projection? You are not your patterns. You are not doomed to repeat the same cycle over and over. You can change the story, but only if you stop running from the mirror. If this message spoke to something inside you, share your reflections in the comments. What projection have you just recognized in your life? And if you're ready to go deeper, check the first pinned comment. We've selected powerful tools and books to help you begin this journey.